Help support the show by joining the Patreon or becoming a YouTube member. Also, hit that like button and subscribe if you want more Browns-focused content. Okay, it's an ongoing theme on this channel. Every day that goes by, it becomes more and more obvious that Deshaun Watson is never playing another down for the Cleveland Browns again. Now, if you're new here, understand, I've said this was the case since he tore his Achilles in October. Ever since that day, it's gotten more and more clear. And honestly, since the Commanders game, it became more and more clear that 2024 was going to be Deshaun Watson's last season as a starter for the Cleveland Browns. All of this stuff has just determined how awkward it is going to be or not going to be. And an article just dropped, I believe it was like the New York Times in collaboration with The Athletic. I think it was Zach Jackson, Jason Lloyd, and some other writers from the New York Times collaborated on a article about the Cleveland Browns. And look, a lot of this article is just telling you shit that you already knew, right? The players don't really believe in Watson the way that they used to believe in Watson. We kind of knew that. There were a couple of quotes in there that I've seen have caught people's eyes. One of the quotes was about Kevin and how he handled meetings with Deshaun, where basically he was critical of Jameis for making mistakes, but he wouldn't criticize Deshaun for making those same mistakes. And I've seen people like get kind of charged up about that, right? And have different kind of takes and opinions. I have a different takeaway from this whole thing than I think most people do, right? I saw that quote pop up, and like my first reaction was what you guys had, or what a lot of people had, where they're like, oh, that doesn't sound good. That could mean that Kevin lost the locker room, all of this stuff. But the reality is that we know that Kevin has not lost the locker room, right? Like, those quotes happened whenever those quotes were given for that article. But at the end of the season, it does not appear that that is the case. And you really got to think about it, right? The Browns internally, and they made this clear when they talked about Watson publicly, thought that the biggest reason he did not look like he did in 2020 was because he had lost confidence during the suspension, during his time away from football. And they felt like it was most necessary to build up his confidence. And part of that means that you're not going to tear him apart in a team meeting in front of everybody, the same way you would tear up a backup quarterback for making a mistake. Now, this is one of those things where I have to remind folks that NFL players are just as complicated as we are, because sometimes we forget. It is very likely that the players in that locker room on one level could be very frustrated at that, and that upsets them, but also is some shit they understand. This happens in workplaces across every job, right? There's stuff that happens when I'm doing this job where I'm like, I don't like that, but I understand it, so I'm going to have to frustratingly just get over it. This, to me, lives in that category where it's like, yeah, it's frustrating, but internally, we know that they're trying to build Watson's confidence because they paid $230 million for him. Some of these guys might have still believed in Watson at the point where he was getting criticized in film. And it is what it is, right? Like, in this article just screams the whole vibe in Berea when it comes to Deshaun Watson was, it is what it is, man. And that is what it is. Now we know that that's going to be over, right? Somebody in that article said it felt like a cloud had been lifted once Deshaun Watson tore his Achilles, which is a crazy quote to have out there. But yeah, that's my thoughts on the article. I know people have asked me about that. What I want to talk about is something I have not talked about since he has retore his Achilles, which is the possibility of the Browns voiding his contract. Now, Albert Breer was on 92.3 The Fan. They asked him about this. Here were his thoughts on the matter.
Albert Breer of the MMQB on the North Olmsted Chrysler Jeep Dodge Ram hotline. Albert, Deshaun re-tears his Achilles. There's some conjecture out there about, how he hurt it, and if it was hurt in a specific way, what that could mean for his contract. What have you heard about the feasibility of the Browns voiding Deshaun's contract for any reason, but maybe most specifically the re-tearing of his Achilles and how it came about?
Yeah, so, here's the way I look at it, guys. If you're going down that road, you're done with them, right? If you start to make moves down that road and you start to walk that path where it's we're going to look into voiding his guarantees, and he finds out about it, then, or you just let him know about it, I think you're probably taking that relationship to a conclusion. And you may be willing to do that, but that's just what it is, So, I do think, if they say, okay, we're going to investigate how this happened. Did this happen while he was training, or did this happen on a boat somewhere? And if it happened while he was training, we're still willing to go after his money because if it did happen while he was training and it wasn't a team-approved training activity, they still could go after it, which, is an interesting kind of loophole in all of this, where anything that happens outside the facility, outside the workplace, can be deemed a non-football injury because it didn't happen under the team's watch. But generally, teams aren't going to punish guys for rehabbing or training outside of their walls, right? In other words, if a guy's doing work towards football and he gets hurt, even though you have the right to void his guarantees, you generally won't do it. So, I just think this is it's a path, yes, to voiding his guarantees, but it's a path where, once you open the door, I don't think you can walk back what you've done, And so I think they're going to have to be careful about this, but certainly, I there's a very clear path where it could wind up voiding his guarantees for sure.
Yeah, I mean, if I was the Browns, I don't care if I burn that bridge. You know what I mean? I got no use for Deshaun at this point.
Okay, but here's the other part of the issue, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I would say this is an important part of it. What does that do with other players? And here's what I mean. Teams are different levels of cutthroat, I'd say.
Mm-hmm.
And let's just say hypothetically, if he retore it because he was doing something dumb, that's something else, right? But let's say he was at a rehab facility in Miami and that's how it happened, right? Then you go and you void his guarantees and you go after his money. Other players are going to see that. How are other players going to look at that? You know what I mean? And if you're another player and you see that, you're making a lot less money than Deshaun, and you see that they did that, you're like, geez. Okay, well, when I'm away from the facility now, if I get hurt, and when I'm away from the facility now, I'm not going to rehab that hard because I got to be careful about it. You know what I mean? So, I just think that can be a tough precedent for a team to set. I think it's something you have to kind of bear in mind if you're moving forward here. Again, if he retore it and they can prove it, stepping off a boat, then yeah, go nuts. You know what I mean? And I'm just using the boat analogy because it's Miami, because he was in Miami and everything else and whatever, right?
Yeah.
But if it happened while he was rehabbing, I do think that's different, and I think it's not just going to affect your dealings with Deshaun going forward. I think it could affect the way other players look at you as a franchise.
Albert, Sam Darnold's last 2 games, not great, Bob. The 15 games before that, 16 games before that were pretty okay with some pretty good numbers. How have the last 2 games, how do you think that'll affect his market in free agency this year, and do you think the Vikings will let him get there?
So when it comes to voiding his guarantees, I'm going to err on the side of it's probably not going to happen for multiple reasons that Albert Breer has brought up and other people have brought up. One, I think the Browns have to balance this weird line of what can get them out the contract versus what could cause them collateral damage with players not named Deshaun Watson down the line. Because if this all worked in a vacuum, the Browns would find any loophole to get out of that contract and to void those guarantees. But this is not happening. in a vacuum, right? Because the only the person whose opinions matter about this isn't necessarily if Deshaun Watson feels like he got robbed. It's if Myles Garrett feels like the organization is willing to rob a player of their guarantees just because it's convenient, right? It's if Denzel Ward thinks that. It's if whoever is next up, right? You got a number 2 overall pick. If that guy turns into a superstar, does that guy feel like the Browns would screw him on the guarantees, right? That is the game that they have to play. So yeah, you could do something that short term will benefit you and try to find any which reason to nickel and dime Deshaun Watson out of all of that guaranteed money. But long term, that could really affect how people view you, how willing people are going to be to get into long-term contracts with you, and how willing players are going to be to stay here long-term. Like, you got to be very careful. There's a way you have to play this, right? If Deshaun was doing something that most people will understand is outside the reasonable expectation of a football player coming back from an injury, then you got something, right? If he was jet skiing, if he was skydiving, if he was doing some kind of dangerous act, playing basketball, right? Like doing some kind of dangerous activity that was unauthorized, that is something that you could easily void the guarantees for. But if it was because he was pushing his rehab too fast, well, then you can't do that, right? I think one of the things Albert Breer brought up is the ideal of, hey, if you do this and you set that precedent, the next time you have somebody come back from an injury, they're going to take it as slow as possible to come back because they're going to be worried that the team's not going to have their back if something happens during that injury. Like, you need that trust there. It's not hypothetical. It matters, right? So you can't just nickel and dime and try to find a reason for Watson to have avoided those guarantees. There has to be a reason there that exists. Now, I will say, it feels like the Browns are trying to get out these guarantees. Like, it feels like they're just poking around because we had the whole suspension thing pop up, right? The ideal of the suspension, voiding his guarantees, with the investigation. The NFL still has not, like, commented on, for whatever reason, past, like, December. It's still apparently an active investigation that they have on Deshaun Watson. We'll see where they go with that. I imagine with him tearing his Achilles and being injured, that investigation has been put on the back burner because it's not going to matter whether Deshaun Watson is suspended or not until like 2026. So I imagine the league's at no rush to pursue that. But there was that whole angle being pursued. He tears his Achilles while playing football. Obviously, you can't say that's non-football related. But then he re-tears it. It depends on how he does. Like, here's a gray area that I don't know how to handle. What if Deshaun Watson rolled his ankle, tore his Achilles again because he was out of his boot too early, but he was just doing something mundane like walking around the house? How does that play if you void his guarantees for that? Not with fans. Fans won't care. Fans would just be happy that the guarantees got voided. But with the people you have to negotiate with in good faith if you're the Cleveland Browns organization in the future, how does that go over? I don't know the answer to that question, right? That is where we can get into these gray areas. And also, like, another truth about this, you got to prove that he was doing something irresponsible. And unless he was doing something irresponsible in front of a large crowd of people where there are witnesses who have no need to hide this information from the Browns, right? So, like, let's say Watson was doing something crazy, but he did it in front of all of his people. Well, that information is not going to come out because those people are incentivized to make this look like it was a football injury. But if he was jet skiing in front of a bunch of witnesses, then all of a sudden that's a problem. But the problem with that theory is, like, if this were something that were that obvious that they could void those guarantees for, we would know. We would have images. We would have people talking about it. We would hear word that Deshaun was on the beach chilling enrolled his ankle, or like we would know a bit more about this situation if it were something that was done in public. I tend to believe he was trying to push his rehab too fast. He was trying to do what Aaron Rodgers did. Remember, Aaron Rodgers last year was acting like he was about to come back from like 2 months after an Achilles injury. He was trying to do all of that. He pushed it really, really hard. And when you push an Achilles recovery really, really hard, you risk two things. Either that Achilles could grow in a stretched way that makes it difficult for you to regain full functional ability with that Achilles muscle, or it tears again. I think that's why that happened. So I wouldn't get my hopes up for the guarantees being voided. But that's my thoughts on that whole thing. The article that came out. I will say this. The only thing that article and the talk about his contract being voided tells me is that he is never playing again for the Cleveland Browns. And that is something we've known for quite a while. Right. I think the national media is slow to catch up onto this because usually that's the case. I remember with the whole Baker Mayfield thing, the national media didn't understand that the Browns were absolutely going to be getting rid of Baker Mayfield until it happened, where we kind of knew that that was going to be the case by the end of that season. This is a similar one. Browns fans, people who cover the team, we've known this is the direction they're going. Every hire they've made, everything they've done points to that. And, you know, this article coming out, the quotes in that article scream that they're going to pivot, make a different direction here. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Do you think Watson will be back again? And do you think the Browns will be able to void his guarantees without, you know, kind of ruining their reputation amongst people who want that security and guarantees for themselves, the players? So let me know what you think. Y'all have a great day. Have an even better night. Peace.